LiSTNR production.
Hey, Chris Spyrou here with the briefing. Repression and media censorship in Venezuela are at an all-time high. Reports of arbitrary detentions, forced disappearances, and torture of political dissidents have skyrocketed following claims that the country's current president, Nicolas Maduro, stole the July 28 election. But now, Venezuelan journalists are fighting back, reporting on events through two AI-generated avatars to avoid persecution. Both those avatars join us now as our first ever AI guests on the show. La Chama and El Pana, welcome to the briefing.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
It's an honor that you're introducing us to Australia.
We were created by AI, but what we share is very real, verified, and high-quality content.
So both of you are AI avatars reporting on real news and events happening in Venezuela. You're not just reporting on the post-electoral political and humanitarian crisis, but you're also raising awareness on the brutal persecution of journalists and censorship there.
In this case, the use of artificial intelligence has nothing to do with the tools that are all the rage right now. It's a shield for journalists from persecution and repression, while upholding the right of people to be informed. Exactly what journalism is about.
12 journalists are imprisoned and facing convictions of up to 20 years in jail. They have been accused of hate-mongering or promoting terrorism when all they are doing is reporting. This brings fear, but as El Pana said, journalism still informs people despite these conditions. We have put artificial intelligence at the service of collective intelligence in an unprecedented effort of collaborative journalism in the region. That is where its power comes from.
So this repression came as a response to protests following a disputed presidential election back in July. The opposition says its candidate Edmundo Gonzalez won the election, while the government says Nicolas Maduro, the current president, was the winner. Now, there's been reports of thousands of detainees and at least 23 or more dead. Can you tell us a little bit more?
After the National Electoral Council announced that the winner was Nicolas Maduro, people took to the streets to protest all over the country. And why? Because those results were clearly hard to believe. Venezuelans have been demanding that the government publish the voting records, since the ones already published by the opposition showed Edmundo Gonzalez as the winner.
The international community became divided after the Venezuelan presidential elections. On one side, the Maduro allies who recognized his victory without asking for any proof. And on the other, those who called for an independent audit to verify the electoral data to ensure transparency.
Thank you both so much for all that information. I'm now going to turn to a real human Venezuelan journalist, LiSTNR Senior Investigative Journalist, Claudianna Blanco. Claudianna, welcome to the briefing.
Thank you for having me.
Now, off mic, you were telling me the names of these presenters are typically Venezuelan.
Yeah, that's right. So the female presenter is called La Chama, which is a widely used colloquial term, a term of endearment, really, to call a girl. Something like Sheila, but not condescending. And the young male presenter is El Pana, which is a Venezuelan slang for mate. And it's used in the same way that mate is used in Australia. And these avatars, their names were designed, the way they look, the way they sound, everything was designed by the journalists who created them precisely to be representative of how Venezuelans look and sound. When they speak Spanish, they speak in a Venezuelan accent. And when they're speaking in English, they speak with a slight Latin American accent on purpose to make them more authentic or relatable.
And there is a lot behind these creations. Do we know about the people that created these avatars?
Yes. So basically, La Chama and El Pana are the hosts of Operación Retweet, which in English is Operation Retweet, which is led by Conectas, a leading collaborative investigative journalism platform in Latin America. So they're the hub that coordinates an extensive network of journalists. And they created the avatars to protect the identities of the real journalists who are literally risking their lives.
And we got a bit of a sense of that risk at the top of the show with that artificial conversation with the journalists. Can you talk to us a little bit more about the scale and the nature of repression that's going on in Venezuela right now?
Yeah, so Venezuelan human rights NGO Foro Penal has verified more than 1,800 arbitrary arrests since the election. The government itself claims the number of those detainees exceeds 2,000. Among the arrested, there are more than 60 minors and even people with disabilities. And some detainees report that they were just like minding their own business when they suddenly got stopped by armed forces. And then they were detained after, the police or the soldiers looked through their phones and then found like pictures of protests or material deemed to be contrary to the government-sanctioned narrative. And President Maduro and his administration have labeled the protesters as fascists, even in TV addresses. Like anybody who opposes the government is labeled a fascist. And they're accused of promoting hatred at the behest of the CIA or the United States, a claim that, of course, Washington denies. The UN recently declared that the scale of repression is unprecedented in Venezuela and amounts to crimes against humanity. In fact, they have recollected evidence of torture, other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment, as well as sexual violence against women, girls, and men. And amongst the methods of torture, there's like electric shocks, immersion, suffocation, the lot. Many of those considered to be enemies also have had their passports inexplicably annulled, and they've received threats against their security and the safety of their families. Many foreign correspondents have been expelled, and a significant number of Venezuelan journalists are now either in exile or hiding. And this is not just about journalists. This is also about prominent political figures, human rights defenders. Many have been arrested under an operation called Operación Tum Tum or Operation Knock Knock. And knock knock meaning that's when armed forces turn up at your door in the middle of the night and, take you, basically.
Whoa.
And some of these arrests have been live streamed. So we know that they actually happened. So Operación Retweet or Operation Retweet came as a direct response to Operation Knock Knock. And I spoke with Carlos Eduardo Huertas, who is the director and editor-in-chief of the Conectas editorial board, and he told me about the scale of this project.
Operación Retweet surge un poco como en respuesta a ese mensaje de Operación Tum Tum.
So what Carlos is saying there is that retweet in the Venezuelan context goes beyond Twitter. It's an increasingly popular expression that means I validate and share. Operación Retweet comprises 14 information platforms and a total of 235 professionals deployed in 31 cities in Venezuela and 15 cities in other countries. This gigantic team carries out a job of contrasting, verifying, investigating, and reviewing documents and searching for sources, which is traditional journalism precisely to deliver contrasted and verified information to its audiences.
And the terrifying thing here, Claude, is that this isn't the first time that Venezuela has made international headlines for disputed elections and political turmoil and social unrest of this nature.
Yeah, sadly, that's the case. So, a bit of context, Venezuela has gone through 25 years of great political turmoil, which has turned into serious polarization and violent unrest at various times. And despite having held many elections, some of these have been disputed and a couple even deemed fraudulent and haven't been fully recognized by the international community. For more than 10 years, the National Electoral Council has been controlled by the ruling government party. So the notion of free and fair elections has been contested for more than a decade. But to better understand this, we need to go back to 1998, which was when Hugo Chavez, a very charismatic, highly popular socialist leader, won the election by a complete landslide. At that time, Venezuela was known as one of the oldest, most stable democracies in South America, but growing corruption and the widening gap between the rich and poor meant that the Venezuelan democracy was showing lots of cracks and flaws when Chavez came to power.
And look, another important point to make is that Venezuela is a very resource-rich country. So Venezuela holds the largest known oil reserves in the world and has natural gas, aluminium, steel, diamonds, gold, the lot. And it's in a prime geopolitical position in South America. So there are many political interests at play. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that's right. So, Venezuela makes news because it matters in many ways, in a resource-heavy kind of way. So Chavez was very popular. When he rose to power, it was just around the time of 9/11 and during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, a time when oil prices were very, very high and Venezuela benefited handsomely. And of course, Venezuela, like the United States, is traditionally one of the biggest buyers of Venezuelan oil, or it was back then. Chavez used the proceeds of oil money to fund a series of social programs to benefit the poor, which gained him a lot of loyal support. However, he was also a populist and displayed very distinct authoritarian features from very early on. So, for example, he sacked anyone from the public service who disagreed with the government or signed petitions against the government. He created blacklists, and his administration was also plagued with corruption scandals, like claims of gross economic mismanagement of a monumental scale, given the amount of money that was pouring into the country. And for many years, Venezuela was deeply polarized, with about half of the population supporting Chavez and his movement, Chavismo, and half of it opposing it. But those percentages of 50-50 started changing significantly as time went on. So Chavez died of cancer in 2013, but before he died, he anointed Nicolas Maduro like in a address, like a nationwide TV address, saying, "This is my successor." And after Chavez's death, Maduro won the presidential election by a margin of less than 1.5 percentage points. By then, Venezuela's economy had shrunk considerably, given plummeting oil prices and gross mismanagement. There were grave food shortages, constant power outages, and a spike in crime. The situation grew worse and worse year on year. And in fact, Maduro has presided over an 80% collapse in GDP. And Venezuela has descended into what has been dubbed a complex humanitarian crisis, where people have even died of starvation. And according to the UNHCR, almost 8 million Venezuelans have fled the country since 2014. That it's more than a quarter of its population. And just to put these numbers into context, these numbers are only comparable to migrations in the refugee crisis following Afghanistan war, Syria war, and the Ukraine war, only that Venezuela is not at war. Most Venezuelans have left the country by foot, crossing over to neighboring Colombia and Brazil, and walking through the Andes down south to other Latin American countries, or walking north through Panama and the jungle all the way up to the United States, because in the United States, Venezuelans have protected status. And this is why, in the United States, the name of the country, Venezuela, is constantly in the election debate, because there are fears that if the Venezuelan crisis intensifies, more millions will head to the U.S. and continue this migratory crisis. But going back to the point of the lack of free and fair elections, in this election in particular, the Electoral Council, for example, banned the opposition leader. And her name is Maria Corina Machado. So she couldn't run for president, so Edmundo Gonzalez ran in her stead.
And we know of Edmundo Gonzalez because he fled the country after the election's supposed loss.
Yeah.
The Avatar said that the opposition published voting results to prove that they had won the election, but the government has not published results. How does that work?
Okay, so on the night of the election, the government just came out and said, "We've won!" With, they provided these questionable total numbers. But so far, they haven't published credible results, like broken down by region, by city. For the opposition to prove its electoral win, they printed out the tallies from about 80% of polling stations. They could do this because in Venezuela, we vote through machines, so it's automatic voting. The opposition then scanned all those results and then published them on the internet for everyone to see and scrutinize. And so at this point, many countries and many independent organizations have gone through those results and accepted them as legitimate. Those countries consider Edmundo Gonzalez as Venezuela's president-elect and insist that Maduro should step down. So the inauguration is set for January 10th, 2025. So that's going to be a key date, but we don't know what will happen Edmundo Gonzalez, as we said, is currently in exile in Spain because he had to flee the country because there was an arrest warrant over his head. But remember that although Edmundo was the opposition candidate, he is really a stand-in for Maria Corina Machado. She is still in Venezuela. She is in hiding, of course, but she has called for an international protest on the 28th of September. So we'll see what happens in coming days.
Claudianna Blanco, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
That was Claudianna Blanco, senior investigative journalist here at LiSTNR, talking about everything that's going on in Venezuela at the moment. That's it for this episode of The Briefing. We'd love it if you could share this episode with someone who you think might enjoy it. And if you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on TikTok and YouTube. Just search LiSTNR Newsroom. And we will be back in your feed tomorrow at 6 a.m. for Headlines with Sash. I'm Chris Spyrou. See you next time.